So I found this Ariens mower for free by using one of my favorite apps to find free items. And most of the time they just leave it by the curb and I don't have to talk to anyone, which is how I prefer it. Nothing against them, but I don't need the interaction. Besides, not knowing makes it a bit more interesting that way. Now the way that it works typically is that they'll post an ad, I'll answer it, and then they'll give me the address if it's not shown, and I show up and take it away. But there are a couple times that it doesn't work out quite that way. In today's video, we're going to take a look at this Ariens lawnmower, and the problem is that according to the previous owners, it simply won't start after a long storage. Apparently there was a move across the country followed by some personal stuff, and now they want it gone to make some room. Now, I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. I'll have to take a look at my records, but I'm pretty sure this has to be the first Ariens lawnmower I've had the pleasure in picking up. But unfortunately, it didn't come without some work, and by that I mean I had to interact with the previous owners. Look, I'm not antisocial. In fact, if you ask anyone that knows me, well, they'll probably tell you I talk too much. But when it comes to running across town to pick up a mower, trying to beat the next person, I am in a bit of a hurry. Besides, every minute I'm not at home means less time to film and produce these videos, so hopefully you understand where I'm coming from. So when I showed up, I was quite surprised to see two people waiting in the garage for me. I then walked up to the house, waving and saying hello, and just hoping that I somehow didn't get the wrong house. Then the two of them came out and we had an awkward conversation about the mower and how they found themselves to be in the state we happen to live in. Now the only good thing that came out of the conversation was that for some reason one side of the handlebar had nuts and bolts securing it. And they were nice enough to offer up their tools so I could take the handlebar down, that way it could fit in my vehicle. But otherwise the rest of the conversation about their personal stuff I could have done without. Not to sound cold about someone's life experiences, but in the situation we were in, I found it to be a little bit more information that I didn't need to know. But am I being mean in saying that though? Now, to be honest, probably so, but then again, I really think it's all about context, and in this situation, I still don't think that most of the information they shared with me really pertained to the mower. Now, you might be saying they're just being friendly, which I really do appreciate, and it's obviously better than someone who's being rude. But as someone who has issues staying focused on just one task at a time, I also want to stay on track of what I need to do as well. Now before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I do want to make sure that the engine will start and run after putting some gasoline into the carb. At least we don't have to worry about getting a new air filter, which means less money invested into the project and more return. So the good news is that the engine starts and runs, and it sounds pretty good as well. Now I didn't hear any strange noises, and I didn't see any oil leaking from the engine either, which, if you didn't know, seems to be a running issue with these. But just to make sure, I'm going to give it a quick washing and also get it down to the bare engine for a better look. Yes, I'm very aware that this mower is fairly clean to begin with, but it's the areas that you can't see that I'm worried about. So one of the biggest issues with lawnmower engines is an oil leak, but it doesn't have to be gushing out of the engine for it to be a big problem. Even having a tiny oil leak can over time result in a broken engine with a free inspection window in the side of the block. Now the most common location for an oil leak on an engine like this one would be at the very bottom where it seals around the shaft. But another location would be right under the cylinder head where the oil pan or sump bolts up to the block. I'm not sure why, but I find more oil leaks right there on this particular brand of engine than any other one I've worked on. Now considering that I work on more Briggs engine than Kohler's, which is what this one is, the percentage of failures is hard to ignore. Now, I really do like this engine. It's very smooth, super quiet, and good on power, but not knowing when it's going to start purging oil does make it a lot less desirable for me to choose. Of course, you don't have to clean your mower, or any mower in fact, to this extent, but seeing as I've never worked on this mower before, it gives me a good reason to do it. Now, if I was planning on keeping this for myself instead of selling it, to be honest, I probably wouldn't wash it again until I put it up for winter. That means during the summer when I'm using it, I'm only going to be blowing off the loose dirt and grass with my leaf blower. Doing it this way will keep the majority of the dirt from ever collecting and building up this badly. Now this is not a car show, so no need to keep it shined up while you're using it. But on the day of the sale, you bet it's going to look the best it can. So why sell it and not keep it? Unfortunately, I've pretty much given the answer already, and it's because it's got a couple of things with it that I don't care for. The first thing I already mentioned, and that's the possibility of the engine springing a massive oil leak. The second reason is that personally I like to mulch my grass, and I like the way my Honda mulches it in comparison to this one. Now the combo of this mowing deck, the blade, and the engine works just fine, but we all have our preferences and this one is simply not for me. So from what I can tell, surprisingly, there are no leaks from this engine, which doesn't happen all too often. But if I did find one, and depending upon how bad it was, we'd have to fix it before moving on. Now, even though I know this engine does start and run, I'd still like to do a health check on it just so that I know what I'm working with. And an easy way to find out is to use a compression tester. Now, I could also do a leak down test, but that also involves me getting out the air compressor, which I wasn't planning on doing just yet. The other reason why is I don't think this engine is bad enough for me to need a leak down test just yet, but I do have a project coming up that I think will be perfect for it, so keep an eye out for that one coming up soon. So the reading is a very strong 165 psi, which means this engine has not been abused and by the looks of it, hasn't been used all that much either. So mechanically, this engine is in fantastic shape, and all we need to do now is examine the fuel system and see what's keeping it from starting. Now there was gasoline in the fuel tank when I got it, so the first thing we need to do is drain what we can from it and see if we can see anything wrong with it. So at first glance, it would seem there's nothing wrong with it. It does have a bit more color to the gasoline, which would point to it being a bit old, but it's still quite usable. Now, just because there's nothing wrong with the gasoline that came from the tank doesn't mean we're in the clear just yet. In fact, all the bad stuff may have already made it to the carb. That means we'll need to drain the bowl and see what comes out of it. And that's exactly what happened. The darker patch at the bottom of the pan is in fact a blob of water. Of course, water in the carb isn't going to let the engine run, but just because we got it out doesn't mean we should start celebrating just yet. Now, since we've come this far, we might as well take off the carb for an inspection and more than likely a good cleaning as well. So even though I didn't mention it earlier, this part of the cleaning and inspection is not my favorite part, and this is the reason why. This has to be the worst looking setup for an auto choking system I've ever seen. This system uses a thermostat to bypass the choke when the engine is hot, but it also has a vacuum bypass as well when the engine is running. The system is rather bulky looking, and with all the linkages, it could get really confusing, especially if you didn't take pictures before taking it apart. The other part that makes this process just a bit more frustrating is having to remove one of the studs to be able to take the carb off the engine. Now that I think of it, I probably should have made a slot at the end of one of the studs. That way you can easily take it off the next time by using a flathead screwdriver instead of doing the way I'm doing it. It's not a real big deal, however, every little extra step is just a reminder of how unfriendly this carb setup really is. I know that a lot of consumers don't like how the Honda is set up either, but I think this one wins the prize. You might not feel the same way about it, and that's perfectly fine, just so long as we agree that a simple setup is definitely preferable. Now maybe I'm doing it wrong or not seeing an easier way to do it, so if you know how to make this easier, I'm all ears. So a good way to tell if you're going to have a bad day is when you get your first look at the inside of the fuel bowl. If it's all crusty or rusty, you're going to have your work cut out for you, but fortunately for us, this one isn't so bad. Now the float and needle are also not stuck, which is even more good news. Next, we're going to get the main jet out of the carb and see if it's blocked with varnish, which is what typically happens when you leave gasoline in a lawnmower for a really long time. And from the way the main jet looks, it would seem that this carb is going to need a fairly thorough cleaning. To prove my point, you can see the deposits on the sides of the needle and even on the very tip. That means it's also in our best interest to also remove the emulsion tube and make sure the openings in it are also clear. It's at this point we can start using various sizes of wire to clear the openings, starting with the main jet. Now I've heard from several people that I should open up the main jet to the next size because the jet is sized to make the engine run lean. However, I'd recommend not doing that, at least not yet. I'll explain more about it here in a bit. The next part I want to look at is the pilot jet, and it's located on top of the carb right below the idle set screw. After counting how many turns it took to remove the screw, you can then just pull up on the jet to remove it. Once out, you're going to notice just how tiny the jet is. In fact, to be able to clear it, you're going to need to use a single wire from a brush. Now originally, I was planning on putting the carb into the ultrasonic cleaner. However, because of the way it was shaped, I couldn't put it into the glass jar I use with the cleaner. Now, that's okay though, since I'm not a really big proponent of using the ultrasonic since it doesn't always seem to work the way I want it to. Now, even though I find that it kind of works for cleaning carbs, I will tell you what it's really good at, which is cleaning my hand tools. So if you use your tools on stuff that gets covered in dirt and grease, the ultrasonic does wonders to get them clean. Just make sure you do a cycle with clean water after using a good detergent on your first cycle. So back to the reason why you shouldn't make the opening in the main jet any bigger, at least not yet. So sometimes when you get the carb back onto the engine and start it up, the engine might start to surge where it basically won't hold a stable idle. When this happens, it could be that the engine is not getting enough fuel, and making the opening in the main jet bigger would make sense. However, it could also happen if the pilot jet is clogged or if there's an air leak between the carb and the engine at a seal or an O-ring. Now, making the opening bigger in the jet might mask the problem, but it's not really addressing the issue it's having. So yes, making the opening larger to compensate will make it seem like that was the problem, but sometimes it's just making a problem less noticeable instead. So once you've figured out that the problem is the jetting and not something else on the engine, then by all means make the opening bigger. But if you make the opening too big, you could cause the carb to deliver too much fuel to the engine and cause it to run badly as well. That's the reason why you need to make sure that kind of modification is something that needs to be done versus something that someone is telling you to do. So what would have happened if I had taken the bowl off for the carb and it was covered in rust? Not only that, but the corrosion even extended into other critical parts of the carb. Unfortunately, I don't know if the carb could be saved, not without putting some major effort into removing all that corrosion. To be honest, after having tried to save carbs like that before, I think the best choice would be to just replace the carb instead. So here's my take on replacing carbs versus cleaning and servicing them. If you have the time, tools, and some skills, then by all means, try cleaning it. But if you're just trying to get your machine up and running and don't plan on doing it as a hobby and time is important to you, then just get a new carb. If you don't see it that way, let me put it another way then. You're paying your friend to fix your mower for you, and you're paying them by the hour. They come back and tell you that the carb is in rough shape and it's going to take more time to try and clean it and might even need multiple cleanings to get it working correctly. I would think that after hearing that bit of information, a $15 aftermarket carb would make more sense than paying them for their time that you would have to pay for. So if you're wondering what the difference is in cost, I would think it would be $50 for labor plus $15 for the carb. Hopefully seeing it from that perspective gives you an idea of why sometimes going with a new carb is the better option. Now, if you've got a lot of time on your hands and you don't like to spend money like me, then I would always try cleaning the carb first. But if you're still having some starting and running issues, that's when you might want to consider a new carb. Now the engine is not completely hot, but it should be warm enough to see if it's going to have a hot starting issue. So unfortunately it didn't start back up, which means we still have some work to do before we even consider selling it. That's the reason why it's important that we do a full running and cutting test. You never know what else might be wrong with it. Now, as for the interaction with the couple that was nice enough to have a conversation with me about it, some of the information they gave me was pretty handy to have. But in this case, it really didn't have much of an impact on how the repair went. But I can never say no to someone who wants to have a conversation with me, so if it comes with a free mower, I guess I'll have to take it. So my question is, are you okay with having conversations with the people giving stuff away for free? Or would you rather just skip the talking altogether and just pick up what you came there for? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.